Hello, a quick revision video on, as you can see in the screen, WEDL, my favorite Pokemon, and Weasel. Okay, so the first thing I need you to pause the video and do is define wage elasticity of demand for labour. So hopefully you've got elasticity of demand for labour measures the responsiveness of quantity demanded of labour to a change in the wage rate. Second thing I need you to do, pause the video, write down the formula. So hopefully you've got the percentage change in quantity demand for labour over the percentage change in the wage rate. Obviously the answer to that is always going to be negative, because as we've seen in the previous video, the demand for labour and the wage rate have an inverse relationship. Now you can draw an elastic demand for labour curve and an inelastic demand for labour curve. So hopefully you've got them. Elastic curves are always fairly flat, and inelastic curves are always fairly steep. So on that, what is the difference between these two curves? So see if you can identify or recall the determinants of WEDL. Pause the video, write them down. So hopefully you've got labour cost as a percentage of total costs, ease of factor substitution, paired with the final product, and time leapt. Okay, so for example, if a firm has got small labour costs as a percentage of total costs, these tend to be for very big companies or very expensive industries. For example, in engineering or in banking, the actual labour costs are quite small because the other costs of running the business are very high. Therefore, if the wage rate goes up, as you can see in the LD2 curve, there will not be a large fall in employment because the firm can swallow up the higher wage costs because it doesn't take up a large proportion of total costs. They won't feel it as much. Whereas in LD1, there might be a big fall in employment if you think about maybe waiters, for example, who actually in restaurants form a large proportion of total costs. Okay, so the waiters, if there's 10 waiters and wage costs go up, then costs actually form a higher percentage of total costs, and therefore they will have an elastic response from the employers and let a few workers go, unfortunately. Ease of factor substitution as well. Tesco's, you're noticing more and more that checkout workers are there's less and less of them because we're moving to self-checkouts. So jobs with low skills, for example in LD1, if the wage rate does go up, Tesco's may look at buying more and more capital, so they may move towards that way of producing the product. And if, like for example, surgeons who get a very high pay, if their wage rate goes up, there will not be that massive fall in employment because it's hard to replace the job a surgeon does with automation and robots. Okay, it's not as easy to replace with capital. Paired with the final product as well. If the final product has got an inelastic demand, if the wage rate goes up, the employer can simply increase the price they charge to increase the revenue and swallow up the increase in costs so that it does not affect their profit. However, if it's an elastic response, if the price of workers' wages increases, that will significantly impact their profit margins. So they unfortunately might have to let some workers go, quite a lot of workers go, because they can't increase the actual price of the product because it's got an elastic demand. So therefore, that's why paired with the final product is a determinant. And time as well. Time kind of implies or affects all of them. If the firm has more time to respond to or you wait for new technologies to develop, it will have a more elastic response. If they don't have a lot of time, they might have to hang on to workers, and therefore it might be a fairly inelastic demand for labour in the short run. Weasel then. See if you can define Weasel. Pause the video. So Weasel is the elasticity of supply for labour, and it measures the responsiveness of quantity supplied of labour to a change in the wage rate. So now you need to write down the formula. Pause the video. Hopefully you've got the percentage change in quantity supplied of labour over percentage change in the wage rate. that will always be a positive figure because there's a positive relationship between the wage rate and the quantity supplied of labour, bearing in mind that the labour supply comes from workers. So now pause the video and draw an elastic and inelastic labour supply curve. So hopefully you've got something along these lines. Again, elastic flat, inelastic steep. And finally, see if you can identify the determinants of Weasel. There's 3. See if you can remember them. Pause the video. So you should have TVs, time, vocation, and skills and qualifications. These all impact the ability for people to respond to higher wages. So for example, skills and qualifications is probably the main one. If you look at LS1 on the left hand side, the elastic supply curve for labour, if a job has fairly low skills and qualifications required, if the wage rate goes up, you will see a lot of people moving into that industry and employing themselves to work in that industry because there's not as many skills required. Whereas if you look at LS2, like maybe that's a doctor, for example, obviously there's a lot of skills and qualifications required. So if the wage rate goes up substantially, you will not see a large increase in employment because not a lot of people have them skills and qualifications. And linking to the time as well, it takes a long time to train to become a doctor, so therefore that increase in employment, labour supply will not be rapid in response. Vocation, again, if you look at LS2, if you go the opposite way, so if the wage rate decreases substantially, there might not be a large fall in the employment or people supplying themselves for labour because of the sense of vocation. Maybe people enjoy working in a particular industry, like nursing, like teaching. So even it's not really, the wage rate isn't really affecting the amount of people that work in that industry. And in other jobs, for example in LS1, if there is a small fall in the wage rate, there might be a lot of people leave that industry because they don't have the same job satisfaction or vocation for the particular job. Okay, so you can screenshot that now, save it. That is WEDL and Weasel in a nutshell.